In the heart of Chicago, there was a busy auto repair shop where cars of all shapes and sizes rolled in every day. The shop buzzed with activity. Mechanics bent over hoods, tools clanging, and customers pacing anxiously as they waited for updates on their vehicles. Among the chaos stood Frank, a quiet, unassuming man who had worked at the shop for over 10 years. His job wasn't glamorous. He swept floors, cleaned greasy tools, and kept the garage tidy. To most people, Frank was just the janitor, someone whose name they barely remembered. But what no one realized was that beneath his calm exterior lay a hidden world of knowledge and skill. Frank hadn't always been a janitor. In his younger days, he'd dreamed of becoming a master mechanic. He'd spent hours tinkering with engines, teaching himself how things worked, and even fixing up old junkers to sell. Cars were his passion, and he loved nothing more than solving complex problems under the hood. But life had other plans for him. A series of personal challenges, a failed business, mounting bills, and family responsibilities forced him to set aside his dreams. Eventually, he found steady work as a janitor at the shop, content to stay out of the spotlight while others handled the heavy lifting. One afternoon, a shiny black luxury sports car pulled into the shop, its engine growling ominously. The owner, Mr. Caldwell, stepped out looking irritated. He explained that the car had been acting up for weeks, and despite taking it to several high-end mechanics, no one could figure out the problem. The shop's top mechanics gathered around the vehicle, scratching their heads as they ran tests and pored over manuals. Hours ticked by, but the solution remained elusive. Frustrated, Mr. Caldwell paced back and forth, muttering about missed deadlines and wasted time. As the debate grew louder, Frank paused his sweeping nearby. Leaning casually against his broom, he listened intently to the mechanics' theories. They tossed around technical terms like fuel injectors and ECU malfunctions, but something didn't add up to Frank. After a moment, he couldn't help himself. With a faint smile, he muttered loud enough for the group to hear, "If I were you guys, I'd check the timing chain tensioner." The room went silent. The mechanics turned to look at him, eyebrows raised. Jake, the head mechanic, broke the silence with a sarcastic laugh. "Oh yeah, Frank. Why don't you fix it then?" His words hung in the air, dripping with disbelief. Everyone expected Frank to shrug it off or walk away. Instead, he surprised them all. Setting down his broom, he straightened up and said, "All right. Why not?" For a moment, the entire shop froze. Was this some kind of joke? Or did Frank actually think he could solve the problem that had stumped everyone else? Curiosity quickly replaced skepticism as Frank walked over to the sports car. Grabbing a wrench from the tool rack, he hesitated only briefly before popping the hood. As he leaned in, memories of his younger days came rushing back. The smell of oil, the hum of engines, the thrill of cracking a tough puzzle. With steady hands, Frank began inspecting the engine bay, moving with a confidence that caught everyone off guard. And as the mechanics watched silently, none of them could deny one thing. Something extraordinary might be about to happen. Frank's decision to step up and take on the challenge sent ripples through the shop. The mechanics exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or feel insulted. Jake, who had initially made the sarcastic comment, crossed his arms and leaned against a workbench, clearly expecting Frank to stumble. "All right, let's see what you've got," he said with a smirk, though there was a hint of curiosity in his tone. Mr. Caldwell, still pacing nearby, stopped mid-step and raised an eyebrow. Even he seemed intrigued by the sudden turn of events. Frank didn't waste time responding to the skepticism. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He moved with surprising efficiency, grabbing tools and inspecting parts with a level of familiarity that caught everyone off guard. At first, the room buzzed with quiet murmurs, mechanics whispering bets on how long it would take for Frank to give up. But as the minutes passed, those whispers faded into silence. It was clear that Frank wasn't just pretending. He knew exactly what he was doing. He started by checking the basics, ruling out common issues like loose belts or clogged filters. Then, without hesitation, he zeroed in on the timing chain tensioner, the very part he'd mentioned earlier. His hands worked deftly, loosening bolts and removing components with precision. Every movement was deliberate, every tool chosen with care. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like chaos under the hood, but Frank's focus never wavered. As he worked, memories flooded back to him. Nights spent hunched over engines in his younger days, poring over manuals and experimenting until he got things right. He remembered the thrill of solving a tough problem, the satisfaction of hearing an engine roar back to life after hours of effort. Those feelings came rushing back now, reigniting a spark he thought had dimmed long ago. For the first time in years, Frank felt truly alive. The other mechanics began gathering around, their initial mockery giving way to genuine interest. They watched as Frank pointed out small details they'd overlooked. A slightly warped gasket here, a misaligned bracket there. Each observation was spot on, revealing a depth of knowledge that none of them had anticipated. When Frank finally located a hairline crack in the timing chain tensioner, the room erupted into stunned silence. It was such a subtle defect that even the most experienced eyes could easily miss it, yet Frank had found it almost effortlessly. Jake stepped forward, scratching his head. "How did you know to look there?" he asked, his voice tinged with both admiration and disbelief. Frank shrugged modestly, wiping grease from his hands. "Just something I picked up along the way," he replied, downplaying his expertise. But the truth was evident. This wasn't luck. It was skill honed over years of practice. By the time Frank finished reassembling the engine, the sports car purred like new. Mr. Caldwell climbed behind the wheel, turning the key with bated breath. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful. A wide grin spread across his face as he revved it a few times, testing its performance. Satisfied, he stepped out of the car and shook Frank's hand firmly. "You're a lifesaver," he said, pulling out his wallet to offer a generous tip. Frank tried to decline, insisting it was just part of the job, but Mr. Caldwell wouldn't hear of it. The atmosphere in the shop shifted dramatically. What had begun as a dare had turned into something far more meaningful. The mechanics, once dismissive, now regarded Frank with newfound respect. Some clapped him on the back, while others bombarded him with questions about his background. How had he learned so much? Why had he been working as a janitor all these years? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone noticed his talent sooner? For Frank, the moment was surreal. He hadn't set out to prove anything. He'd simply acted on instinct. But as he stood there, surrounded by colleagues who were finally seeing him for who he really was, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this was his chance to reclaim a piece of the dream he'd left behind. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything, for him and for everyone at the shop. The buzz in the shop didn't die down anytime soon. After Frank fixed the luxury sports car, the mechanics couldn't stop talking about what had just happened. For years, they'd thought of him as the guy with the mop, someone whose role was limited to keeping the place clean. But now, standing before them was a man who had solved a problem that had stumped even their best technicians. It wasn't just impressive. It was downright humbling. Jake, the head mechanic, found himself replaying the scene in his mind. He had been the one to challenge Frank initially, expecting nothing more than a laugh at the janitor's expense. But instead of backing down, Frank had risen to the occasion, and done so with a level of skill that left Jake questioning his own assumptions. As he watched Frank quietly return to sweeping the floor, almost as if nothing unusual had happened, Jake felt a pang of guilt mixed with admiration. This wasn't just a lucky guess. It was clear that Frank knew cars inside and out. Curiosity got the better of the team, and they began peppering Frank with questions. "Where did you learn all this?" one of them asked. Another chimed in. "Why didn't you ever say anything before?" At first, Frank hesitated, unsure how much to share. But seeing the genuine interest on their faces, he decided to open up. He told them about his younger days, when cars weren't just machines, they were his passion. Growing up, he'd spent countless hours tinkering with engines, teaching himself how things worked. He'd even dreamed of opening his own repair shop someday. But life had other plans. A failed business venture left him deep in debt, forcing him to take whatever job he could find. Cleaning garages paid the bills, even if it meant setting aside his dreams. Over time, he grew used to staying in the background, content to let others take the spotlight. His story struck a chord with everyone in the room. They realized that beneath Frank's quiet demeanor lay a wealth of untapped potential. Some of the younger mechanics expressed awe at his ability to diagnose problems so quickly, while others admitted feeling inspired by his resilience. Even Mr. Caldwell, still beaming from having his prized car repaired, lingered a little longer than necessary to thank Frank personally. "You've got real talent," he said warmly before driving off, leaving behind a trail of admiration. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came from Jake. Later that evening, after the shop had closed and the noise of the day had faded, he approached Frank. Holding out a hand, he said simply, "I owe you an apology." Frank looked up, surprised but not unkind. "No need for that," he replied with a small smile. Jake shook his head firmly. "Yes, there is. I underestimated you, and I was wrong. You're incredible at what you do." The moment marked a turning point in their relationship. From then on, Jake made a conscious effort to treat Frank as an equal, often seeking his opinion during tough repairs. Other mechanics followed suit, inviting Frank to join discussions and brainstorm solutions. Slowly but surely, Frank transitioned from being an invisible figure in the corner to becoming an integral part of the team. Still, Frank remained humble. He never sought recognition or praise, preferring to let his work speak for itself. Yet every time he offered insight or helped solve another tricky issue, the respect for him grew. The shop dynamic shifted in subtle yet profound ways, with Frank's presence reminding everyone of the importance of humility, patience, and open-mindedness. As days turned into weeks, the memory of the sports car incident lingered, not because it was extraordinary, but because it revealed something deeper. Talent isn't always where you expect it to be. And sometimes, the people we overlook have the most to offer. For Frank, this realization brought a renewed sense of purpose. And for the shop, it sparked a culture of collaboration and mutual respect that would shape its future in unexpected ways. Word of Frank's unexpected triumph spread like wildfire, not just within the shop but beyond its walls. Mechanics who worked at neighboring garages heard about the janitor who had fixed a luxury sports car in record time. Customers who visited the shop began asking for the guy with the golden touch, unaware that he wasn't officially a mechanic. Even Mr. Caldwell, thrilled with the results, couldn't stop talking about Frank to his friends and colleagues. He recommended the shop to several high-profile clients, many of whom brought in their own complicated, high-end vehicles, eager to see if the rumors were true. The shop owner, Linda, quickly noticed the change. Business was booming, and much of it seemed tied to Frank's growing reputation. At first, she chalked it up to good luck or a one-time fluke. But as more cars came in, and as Frank continued to quietly contribute to solving tough problems, she realized that there was something special about him. One afternoon, after closing hours, she called Frank into her office. "Frank," she began, leaning forward with a thoughtful expression, "I need to talk to you about something." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure what this meeting might entail. Was he in trouble? Had he overstepped by working on cars instead of sticking to his usual duties? To his surprise, Linda smiled warmly. "You've been doing incredible work around here," she said, "not just with cleaning, but with the repairs too. I think it's time we gave you a chance to step into a bigger role." Linda explained that she wanted to offer Frank a trial position as a junior mechanic. She assured him that he wouldn't be thrown into the deep end. The team would support him while he learned modern diagnostic tools and techniques. It was a risky move, given that Frank hadn't formally trained as a mechanic in decades, but Linda believed in his potential. "You've already proven yourself," she added. "Now let's see how far you can go." Frank was stunned. For years, he kept his head down, never imagining he'd get another shot at pursuing his passion. The idea of stepping back into the world of mechanics excited him, but it also scared him. Technology had advanced so much since his younger days. Cars now relied on complex computer systems and sensors, things he barely understood. Could he really keep up? After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "I'll give it a try," he said, his voice tinged with both determination and uncertainty, "but I'll need help." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of learning and adaptation. During the day, Frank juggled his janitorial duties with shadowing the senior mechanics. In the evenings, he pored over manuals and watched online tutorials, determined to catch up with the latest advancements. The transition wasn't easy. There were moments when frustration bubbled over, like when he accidentally triggered a warning light on a customer's dashboard or struggled to navigate diagnostic software. But every setback only fueled his resolve to improve. What surprised Frank most was the encouragement he received from his coworkers. Jake, who had once doubted him, became his unofficial mentor, patiently walking him through tricky procedures and explaining technical jargon. Other mechanics pitched in too, sharing tips and offering constructive feedback. Their support made all the difference, turning what could have been a lonely journey into a collaborative effort. As Frank grew more confident, his contributions to the shop became undeniable. He started tackling smaller jobs independently, earning praise from customers and colleagues alike. Each success boosted his morale, pushing him to take on bigger challenges. Slowly but surely, Frank transformed from a quiet janitor into a trusted member of the team, a man whose presence inspired those around him. The ripple effect of Frank's growth extended beyond the shop floor. His story reminded everyone that talent isn't bound by titles or roles. It taught them to look beyond surface-level assumptions and appreciate the hidden strengths in others. And for Frank, it reignited a spark he thought had faded forever, a reminder that second chances are possible, no matter how unlikely they may seem. Months had passed since Frank began his journey as a junior mechanic, and the shop was buzzing with energy. Business was better than ever, thanks in part to Frank's growing reputation. Word of his unique story, the janitor-turned-mechanic, had spread far and wide, drawing in curious customers and challenging projects. But Frank wasn't resting on his laurels. Every day, he pushed himself to learn more, to refine his skills, and to prove that he belonged among the best. One crisp autumn morning, a gleaming vintage race car rolled into the shop. Its owner, an elderly collector named Mr. Whittaker, explained that the vehicle had been plagued by chronic overheating issues for years. Despite countless attempts by other mechanics to fix it, the problem persisted. "It's like this car has a mind of its own," Mr. Whittaker joked, though there was a hint of frustration in his voice. The shop's lead mechanics examined the engine bay, scratching their heads as they debated possible causes. Sensors were checked, fluids replaced, and cooling systems inspected, but nothing seemed to work. Frank watched from the sidelines, listening intently as theories flew back and forth. He remembered reading about similar problems in old racing models during his late-night study sessions. Something about the layout of the radiator hoses caught his eye. They looked slightly misaligned, which could restrict airflow and cause uneven cooling. It was a subtle detail, but one that might explain the persistent overheating. After some hesitation, Frank approached Jake and suggested taking a closer look at the hose alignment. Jake raised an eyebrow, but nodded, trusting Frank's instincts. Together, they dismantled the front end of the car, carefully inspecting each component. Sure enough, they discovered that one of the hoses had been installed incorrectly, creating a bottleneck that disrupted the flow of coolant. With a few adjustments and a thorough cleaning of the radiator fins, the issue was resolved. When Mr. Whittaker returned to pick up his prized possession, he couldn't believe the difference. The engine ran cooler and smoother than it had in years, Overwhelmed with gratitude, he shook Frank's hand vigorously and promised to recommend the shop to every collector he knew. True to his word, referrals poured in from across the region. Classic cars, rare imports, and high-performance machines all found their way to the garage. Each new project brought fresh challenges, but also opportunities for Frank to shine. As his confidence grew, so did his role within the team. Frank wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was mentoring younger mechanics, sharing insights from both his past experiences and his recent crash course in modern technology. His teaching style was patient yet practical, often involving hands-on demonstrations. "You don't need fancy tools to figure out what's wrong," he'd say. "Sometimes, all it takes is paying attention to the little things." The shop's dynamic shifted noticeably under Frank's influence. What had once been a competitive environment transformed into a collaborative space where everyone worked together to solve problems. Even Jake, who had initially doubted Frank, now openly admired his dedication and expertise. "He's got a gift," Jake told Linda one evening. "Not just with cars, but with people too." Frank's impact extended beyond the shop floor. Customers began requesting him specifically, trusting his judgment and appreciating his humble demeanor. Some even brought in snacks or small tokens of gratitude, which Frank always accepted with a shy smile. For someone who had spent years blending into the background, being recognized felt surreal, but deeply rewarding. By the end of the year, Frank had become an indispensable part of the team. His journey from janitor to respected mechanic was no longer seen as unusual. It was celebrated as proof that talent and determination can overcome any obstacle. And while Frank still swept the floors and cleaned tools when needed, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. After all, he knew better than anyone that sometimes the smallest actions can lead to the biggest changes. Frank's growing reputation reached its peak when he decided to enter a local car restoration competition. The event was a big deal in the community, drawing participants from across the state, seasoned professionals, hobbyists, and even students eager to showcase their skills. When Frank announced his intention to compete, the shop erupted into chatter. Some were excited, others skeptical, but everyone agreed on one thing. If anyone could pull off something extraordinary, it was Frank. Knowing the challenge ahead, Frank teamed up with Jake, the head mechanic who had once doubted him but now stood firmly by his side. Together, they chose a rusted-out classic muscle car, a 1967 Chevrolet Camaro that had been sitting in the shop's back lot for years. The car was in rough shape, its paint chipped, its interior torn, and its engine barely functional. To most people, it looked like a lost cause. But Frank saw potential where others saw junk. "This car has stories to tell," he said with a grin. "We just need to help it tell them." The weeks leading up to the competition were grueling. Frank and Jake worked late into the nights, stripping the car down to its frame and rebuilding it piece by piece. They debated every decision, from the type of paint to use, a glossy red that matched the original design, to whether to upgrade the suspension system. Frank insisted on staying true to the car's roots while incorporating subtle modern touches, ensuring it would run smoothly without losing its vintage charm. What made their partnership special wasn't just their shared goal. It was the bond they formed along the way. Jake admitted that working alongside Frank had taught him more than just technical skills. It had reminded him why he fell in love with cars in the first place. For Frank, having Jake's support meant everything. It wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about creating something meaningful together. On the day of the competition, the restored Camaro turned heads the moment it rolled onto the display floor. Its flawless paint job gleamed under the lights, and its polished chrome accents sparkled like new. Inside, the leather seats smelled fresh, and the dashboard gleamed with precision craftsmanship. Under the hood, the rebuilt V8 engine roared to life, drawing applause from the crowd. Judges circled the car, inspecting every detail and nodding approvingly. When the winners were announced, no one at the shop was prepared for what came next. Against all odds, Frank and Jake took home first prize. The judges praised not only the quality of their work, but also the passion and teamwork evident in every aspect of the restoration. As they accepted the trophy, Frank felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just a win for him. It was validation for everyone who had believed in him, supported him, and given him a second chance. Back at the shop, the celebration was electric. Linda ordered pizza, and the team gathered around to toast Frank and Jake's victory. One of the younger mechanics raised his soda can and shouted, "To Frank, the man who proved that greatness comes from the heart." Everyone cheered, clinking cans and laughing as stories from the past year spilled out. For Frank, the accolades weren't what mattered most. What truly moved him was seeing how far he'd come and how many lives he'd touched along the way. His journey had inspired others to dream bigger, work harder, and never underestimate the power of perseverance. And though he still wore his worn-out work boots and carried a humble demeanor, there was no denying it. Frank was no longer just the janitor. He was a master mechanic, a mentor, and a symbol of hope for anyone chasing a dream they thought was lost. Years passed, and Frank became a cornerstone of the auto shop. His journey from janitor to master mechanic had transformed not only his life, but also the culture of the entire workplace. The shop was no longer just a place where cars were fixed. It had become a hub of learning, collaboration, and inspiration. Customers came from far and wide, drawn by the reputation of its skilled team, especially Frank, whose name had become synonymous with excellence. Frank's role evolved beyond fixing engines. He became a mentor to younger mechanics, sharing his wisdom and encouraging them to approach problems with patience and creativity. "Every car has a story," he'd often say. "Your job isn't just to fix it, it's to listen." His advice resonated deeply with the apprentices, many of whom had grown up in an era dominated by technology and quick fixes. Under Frank's guidance, they learned to appreciate the artistry behind automotive repair, blending old-school craftsmanship with modern techniques. Despite his success, Frank remained humble. He never sought the spotlight, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But others made sure his contributions weren't overlooked. Linda, the shop owner, frequently highlighted Frank's achievements during community events and interviews. "This shop wouldn't be what it is today without him," she'd say proudly. Her words carried weight, and soon Frank's story spread beyond Chicago, inspiring people across the country. When Frank finally decided to retire, the shop threw him a farewell party that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Mechanics, customers, and even past clients gathered to celebrate the man who had touched so many lives. Stories poured in. One customer recounted how Frank had gone above and beyond to repair her son's first car on a tight budget. Another remembered how Frank stayed late one snowy night to ensure their family could safely travel home for the holidays. Each tale painted a picture of a man defined not by his skills alone, but by his kindness and dedication. To honor Frank's legacy, Linda announced the creation of the Frank Thompson Spirit of Excellence Award. Every year, the shop would present this award to an apprentice or junior mechanic who demonstrated exceptional skill, perseverance, and teamwork, qualities that embodied Frank's spirit. It was a fitting tribute, ensuring that his influence would continue to shape future generations of mechanics. On his last day, Frank walked through the shop one final time, taking in the sights and sounds he'd grown to love. The hum of tools, the smell of grease, the laughter of coworkers, it all felt like home. As he reached the exit, he turned back to see the team gathered behind him, clapping and cheering. Jake stepped forward, holding out a framed photo of the restored Camaro they'd worked on together. "For everything you've done. For us, for this shop, for yourself. We'll never forget you," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Frank smiled, his eyes glistening. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied softly. "This place will always be a part of me, just like I hope I'll always be a part of it." With that, he waved goodbye and stepped out into the sunlight. Though Frank was no longer physically present, his impact lingered in every corner of the shop. New hires heard tales of the janitor who saved the day and marveled at how one man's determination had changed so much. Tools once used by Frank were treated with reverence, almost as if they carried a piece of his soul. And whenever someone faced a particularly tough repair, they found themselves asking, what would Frank do? Frank's retirement marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. A legacy built on resilience, humility, and the belief that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places. For those fortunate enough to know him, Frank wasn't just a mechanic. He was proof that second chances are possible, that passion can reignite at any age, and that true success lies not in accolades, but in the lives we touch along the way. Frank's retirement didn't mean the end of his story. It was more like a new chapter. Though he no longer worked at the shop, his influence continued to ripple through the lives of those he touched. The Frank Thompson Spirit of Excellence Award became a cherished tradition, inspiring young mechanics to strive for greatness. Each year, as a new recipient stood on stage holding the trophy, they were reminded of the quiet janitor who dared to dream and proved that talent and hard work could overcome any obstacle. But Frank wasn't done sharing his gifts with the world. Retirement gave him time to revisit old passions he'd set aside long ago. He started tinkering with cars again, not for customers or competitions, but for himself. In his small garage at home, he restored classic vehicles, transforming them into rolling works of art. Word spread quickly among neighbors and friends, and soon people began stopping by to admire his creations. Some even asked if he'd consider selling them, but Frank always shook his head. "These aren't for sale," he'd say with a grin. "They're my way of keeping the past alive." One day, while working on a 1950s pickup truck, Frank had an idea. What if he used his skills to give back to the community? He reached out to local youth organizations and offered free workshops for teenagers interested in learning about cars. At first, turnout was modest, but word of Frank's generosity spread, and before long, his garage was filled with eager kids eager to get their hands dirty. They learned how to change oil, replace brakes, and diagnose engine problems, all under Frank's patient guidance. More importantly, they learned the value of perseverance and teamwork. For Frank, these workshops were deeply fulfilling. Seeing young faces light up when they solved a mechanical puzzle reminded him of his own early days, when every fixed car felt like a victory. One boy, Marcus, stood out in particular. Shy and unsure at first, Marcus blossomed under Frank's mentorship, showing a natural aptitude for mechanics. By the end of the summer, Marcus had rebuilt an old scooter all by himself. When he proudly showed it off to his parents, they credited Frank with sparking their son's confidence and ambition. As the years went by, Frank's impact grew beyond what anyone could have imagined. Former workshop participants went on to pursue careers in automotive engineering, mechanics, and design. Many credited Frank with setting them on their path, saying he taught them not just technical skills, but life lessons about resilience and humility. Even Jake, now the head mechanic at the shop, often brought apprentices to visit Frank, knowing that spending time with him would inspire them to aim higher. Though age eventually slowed Frank down, his spirit remained unshakable. On sunny afternoons, you'd still find him sitting in his driveway, polishing a freshly restored fender or chatting with passersby about the joys of working with your hands. His garage became a neighborhood landmark, a place where stories were shared, advice was given, and dreams took flight. When Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire community mourned. But instead of sadness, his funeral was filled with laughter, gratitude, and memories. People spoke of how he'd changed their lives, one repair, one lesson, one kind word at a time. The shop closed for the day in his honor, and dozens of cars lined the streets outside the ceremony, each one a testament to Frank's legacy. Today, Frank's name lives on not just in awards or stories, but in the hearts of everyone he inspired. From the bustling auto shop to the quiet corners of his garage, his journey reminds us that greatness isn't defined by titles or fame. It's measured by the lives we touch and the dreams we help others achieve. And though Frank may be gone, his spirit endures, proving that sometimes the smallest actions can leave the biggest mark.